On the inner walls of the Temple of Amun at Karnak, Egyptian scribes carved a campaign diary in stone. It names the days, it lists the towns, it records the arguments in the war council. It follows an army from the edge of Egypt into the hills of Canaan. For the Battle of Megiddo, this record remains the oldest detailed account of a battle that survives from the ancient world. The text opens with the pharaoh's titles and a clear order. His victories were to be written down for Amun. The record begins at Tharu, the frontier fortress at the eastern edge of the delta. In year 22, on the 25th day of the 4th month of the 2nd season, the king stood there, ready for his first expedition to push Egypt's borders outward by force. The inscription says that the Asiatic lands had fallen into disputes, each group fighting its neighbor, and that the towns around Sharuhen had begun to rebel. It also says the campaign was recorded day by day and later set down on a leather roll kept in Amun's temple. Thutmose III had spent years in the shadow of Queen Hatshepsut, the senior ruler of the court. Her death ended that arrangement. Egypt now had one voice at the top. A young king had to show that the throne still commanded obedience. Egypt's system in Canaan depended on vassal princes who paid tribute and kept roads open for trade, diplomacy, and war. A revolt threatened that structure. Thutmose responded with a field army and an advance timed for the campaigning season. This first campaign became the best documented, and it was placed on the walls of Karnak as a public statement of royal power. In the spring of year 23, the diary tracks the king's movements day by day. On the 4th day of the 1st month of the 3rd season, he reached Gaza. The next day, the text records his departure in might, in power, and in triumph. 11 days later, on the 16th, he arrived at Yehem. Gaza sat on the coastal route north out of Egypt. From there, the army moved through the southern Levant toward the Carmel Ridge and the Jezreel Valley, the corridor that linked Egypt with Syria and Mesopotamia along major land routes. Scribes traveled with the army and recorded what they saw. Their notes became the material for the carved annals at Karnak. The text gives its own calendar date for the battle itself, the 21st day of the 1st month of the 3rd season in year 23. Modern chronologies differ when they convert that date into a year on the modern calendar, and the estimates vary across publications. The Egyptian account stays consistent on the sequence of days and the route. The army on the march included infantry and a chariot corps. New Kingdom troops fought with bows and arrows, spears, javelins, maces, clubs, slings, and throw sticks. Close combat weapons included daggers, axes, and the sickle sword, a weapon introduced from Western Asia. The horse-drawn chariot served as the main shock arm and a mobile platform for an elite crew. A typical chariot carried 2 men, a driver who could also handle a shield, and a warrior. Horses and chariots had entered Egypt earlier, and by Dynasty 18 the court and the army had built tactics around them. Megiddo itself stood as a fortified town on a tell, a mound formed by many rebuilt layers. Its location mattered because it watched the route known in later periods as the Via Maris, a main road used for travel between Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia. Controlling Megiddo meant controlling access along this trade route. The surrounding landscape forced movement into channels. The Carmel Range and nearby passes shaped where armies could travel with carts, horses, and supplies. The enemy leadership chose Megiddo as their rally point. The Karnak text names the main leader as the Chief of Kadesh. Kadesh lay far to the north on the Orontes River, but its ruler had influence among Levantine towns. In the inscription, Thutmose tells his officers that this enemy has gathered to himself the chiefs of all the countries which are on the water of Egypt, and as far as Naharin, along with their horses and their troops. The king quotes the enemy's claim, "I have arisen to fight against his majesty in Megiddo." The war council took place at Yehem. The text preserves the tone of the officers. They spoke like men thinking about road width, marching order, and the risk of an ambush. 3 approaches led toward Megiddo. 2 were longer and broader. One led toward Tanakh. Another passed north of a place the text calls Zefti, coming out north of Megiddo. The third, the Aruna Road, ran through a narrow pass. The officers spoke their fear out loud. "How is it that we should go upon this road, which threatens to be narrow?" they asked. "Will not horse come behind horse and man behind man likewise?" They warned that the vanguard could be fighting while the rear still stood back in the pass, unable to help. Then they asked the king to choose one of the other routes and spare them the difficult road. Thutmose answered with an oath. He swore by the gods named in the text. "My majesty will proceed upon this road of Aruna," he said. He invited any man who wished to take the other roads. He also gave the reason that mattered to him. The enemy expected caution. The enemy would believe the king feared them if he avoided the direct route. The council ended with the officers pledging to follow. They asked Amun of Thebes to grant the king life. They declared that they would go wherever he went, as the servant is behind his master. Orders went out to the entire army. The diary describes the march as single file at points. "None shall go forth in the way before my majesty," the king swore. He led from the front. The record includes a line meant to fix the image of the column in memory, horse behind horse, with the king at the head of his army. This choice carried risk in exchange for time and surprise. A narrow pass could be blocked. A column could be cut in 2. If an enemy force waited at the exit, the first units would meet them before the rest could deploy. The inscription itself shows that the risk was understood inside the Egyptian command. On the 19th day of the month, the army spent the night at Aruna. The record gives the king's own voice again, speaking of divine protection as he moved north. Outside Egypt, divine language and military language blended in the official record. It framed the king as commander and as the favored son of Amun. The practical effect was discipline. A long column moving through rough ground needed cohesion. It needed steady pacing, clear signals, and control of fear. The enemy deployment waited beyond the hills. The Egyptian text reports that the enemy went out in numerous battle array. It places one wing at Tanakh and another near the ground south of Megiddo. These details matter because they show where the coalition expected Egypt to come from. The enemy guarded the wider approaches. Their forces did not block the Aruna route in the way the Egyptian officers feared. The record moves forward to the moment of exit into the valley. As the vanguard reached open ground, the commanders raised a new concern. The front of the army had emerged, while the rear still wound through the pass. Officers urged the king to protect the rear until the entire force came out. The diary preserves their words. They wanted the whole army ready before a fight began. Thutmose halted and waited, guarding the rear as the column finished the pass. The text notes the time by the position of the sun. It says that when the front reached the exit, the shadow had turned. By the 7th hour of the day, the king reached the south of Megiddo on the bank of the Brook of Kina. At this point, the text gives exact detail about the final hours before combat. Camp went up near water. Orders were shouted and carried along the lines. "Equip yourselves. Prepare your weapons." The command was for a battle at dawn. Watchmen moved through the camp, repeating short phrases to keep men alert. "Steady of heart, steady of heart, watchful, watchful." A messenger came to the royal tent with a report. "The land is well, and the infantry of the south and north likewise." The king rested in his tent. The chiefs had their affairs arranged. Provisions were issued. In the darkness before the new moon feast day, the Egyptian army waited on the plain south of Megiddo in full order and read. Early in the morning, on the feast of the new moon, the camp moved. Orders ran down the lines. Men tightened leather straps, checked bowstrings, and gathered shields. Charioteers brought teams forward. The king rode out in a chariot of electrum, with his weapons laid out for battle. The Egyptian formation took shape on the ground south of Megiddo. The annals place the southern wing on a hill south of the brook of Kina. The northern wing stood northwest of Megiddo. Thutmose held the center. The text presents this as a controlled deployment, with the king placed where he could direct the fight. The enemy coalition waited closer to the city. The Egyptian record describes a large force gathered under the chief of Kadesh and allied rulers. It also describes their equipment. Horses and chariots formed the prestige arm of the Levantine princes, with infantry behind and around them. This was the kind of battle where speed, order, and discipline mattered. A chariot line that broke at the wrong moment could scatter into its own foot soldiers. The first contact came fast. The annals compressed the clash into a few sentences, focused on the result. His Majesty prevailed against them at the head of his army, the text says. The coalition forces turned and ran toward Megiddo. In the Egyptian telling, the flight began as soon as the enemy saw the king pressing forward. The retreat became a rush for the gates. Horses and chariots were abandoned on the field. Men ran without formation. The people inside Megiddo shut the city against them. Clothes were lowered on ropes from the wall, and the fugitives were pulled up by their garments. The annals keep returning to this image because it explains what happened next. The enemy leaders reached safety behind the walls. The Egyptian troops poured into the abandoned camp. They took tents, weapons, chariots, and horses. The annals state that the army's focus shifted to plunder, and that this cost them the chance to take Megiddo immediately. The record places the failure in plain language. If the army had kept its order and pushed straight on, the city would have fallen at once, with the coalition's rulers still outside and exposed. Thutmose heard the cheering, and he also heard what his men had chosen to do. He spoke to the officers in a way meant to sting. The annals preserve the line that became famous. The capture of Megiddo is the capture of 1,000 cities. Then he gave the direct order, "Capture ye mightily, mightily." The battle had ended with the enemy trapped inside the fortress, and the campaign turned into a siege. The Egyptians measured the city. They built an enclosure around it using fresh timber taken from nearby trees. The annals even record the official name given to this barrier. Menkheper is the surrounder of the Asiatics. Sentries were posted, and an order followed. No one was to come out beyond the wall except to surrender. This was siege work done by soldiers with axes, picks, and baskets. Timber had to be cut. Posts had to be carried and set. A ditch could be dug where the ground allowed. Guards needed shifts, water, and food. Supplies had to come in from the countryside or from friendly towns. The same road network that made Megiddo valuable also allowed an army to feed itself if it held the approaches. Inside the city, the defenders faced a narrowing set of options. Food stores could stretch only so far. Horses and cattle inside the walls meant more mouths. A crowded garrison also meant sickness, and the annals later mention famine-driven surrenders in towns taken during this phase of the campaign. The siege length appears in more than one tradition. Some accounts describe 7 months, and a later inscription from Gebel Barkal includes the plea spoken to the Egyptian king, "Give us thy breath, O our Lord." Other summaries give an estimate of 8 months. These figures agree on the main point. Megiddo held out for many months, while the Egyptian army maintained the enclosure. While Megiddo remained under guard, Thutmose also acted in the region. The annals list additional towns taken and additional captives brought in. They name places such as Yenoam, Nuges, and Herenkeru in connection with further seizures of people and goods. This fits the logic of siege warfare. A besieging army often reduces nearby strongpoints, denies the enemy support, and gathers supplies from the surrounding area. The record then turns to accounting. Officials counted hands taken from the dead, a practice used in Egyptian armies as a way to tally enemy casualties. They counted prisoners. They counted animals. They listed chariots and armor taken from the camp and from the field. The numbers are specific because this part of the inscription served a political purpose. The king's victory could be measured and displayed in the temple as proof of success and as an offering to Amun. The annals list 340 living prisoners and 83 hands. They list 2,041 mares, 191 foals, and 6 stallions. They list 924 chariots. They list 200 suits of armor and 502 bows. They list herds taken as booty, including 1,929 large cattle and tens of thousands of small livestock. Modern discussions often note that the composite bow was expensive and valued, and that captured bows and armor reflected elite equipment on the Levantine side. They also list prestige items that came from the enemy leadership. A chariot, wrought with gold, is attributed to the chief of Kadesh. Another is attributed to the chief of Megiddo. The annals describe the capture of the enemy's tent, and they note that the enemy's son was inside it. In practical terms, taking a royal tent meant taking the administrative center of a field command, along with documents, supplies, and valuables stored with the leader. As the months passed, pressure rose inside the city. The later Gebel Barkal text frames the surrender as a direct appeal to the king. The defeated asked for breath and pledged that the people of retinue would never rebel again. This kind of wording belongs to royal inscriptions, but it also points to a real condition. The garrison reached a point where it could not continue without opening the gates. When the surrender came, the campaign shifted again, from killing and capture to political control. Thutmose allowed many of the rulers and elites to return to their towns under renewed obligations. The annals include a detail meant to mark humiliation and control. They went away mounted on donkeys because the Egyptians took their horses. A horse in this period was a military asset and a status symbol. Removing horses reduced the ability to rise in revolt again. The record also shows another method of control. It lists children and family members taken as part of the settlement. It lists 87 children of the enemy and of chiefs who were with him, along with a larger total of men, women, and children taken as slaves and non-combatants who surrendered because of famine. These people served as leverage. A ruler who had family at the Egyptian court faced a powerful incentive to keep agreements. The annals also describe tribute arriving to the king. Silver, gold, lapis, lazuli, and malachite are named among the offerings. Grain, wine, cattle, and small livestock are listed as provisions for the army. This was a campaign with a battlefield and a siege, and it was also an extraction operation. The king's presence forced payments. Those payments fed the troops and enriched the court. By the end of the Megiddo campaign, Egypt had reasserted control over a key corridor in the southern Levant. Megiddo's position mattered because it controlled one of the main routes leading north from Egypt through the Jezreel Valley. Later scholarship and museum material often underline this strategic fact because it explains why so many armies fought near this site across many centuries. The year given for the battle in modern writing varies with the chronology used for Thutmose III's reign. Many modern references place it around 1457 BCE, and some reconstructions place it around 1458 BCE. The Egyptian source itself anchors the event to year 23 and to the day of the new moon feast in the king's regnal calendar. The effect of this campaign reached far beyond one city. Thutmose did not stop after Megiddo. He led repeated expeditions into the Levant, and later sources describe these campaigns as nearly annual in tempo during parts of his reign. His first campaign became the template and the public proof. It was carved at Karnak and presented as a record of success granted by the gods, with the king at the front of the army and foreign rulers brought back into line. The next step was administration. Egypt relied on local princes to govern towns, collect goods, and keep roads open, under Egyptian oversight. This system required enforcement, and Megiddo showed what enforcement looked like. A coalition could gather in revolt. Egypt could respond with a field army. A city could be sealed until hunger forced a decision. Horses could be taken. Captives could be marched south. Thutmose's later reputation grew from the accumulation of these campaigns. Encyclopedic summaries describe him as a major empire builder whose military expeditions extended Egypt's power in the Levant and Nubia. Megiddo stands at the start of that arc as the first campaign recorded in detail on temple walls. The annals close the Megiddo section with the voice of record keepers. They claim that everything the king did against the city and the enemy was recorded each day and set down on a roll of leather in the Temple of Ammon. That line matters because it explains why this battle remains so visible across time. Many earlier battles surely happened. Many later battles were fought. Few were recorded with this kind of day-by-day structure, with quoted speeches, route choices, and lists of captured equipment. In the end, the story that survived is the story the Egyptians chose to carve. A king left Gaza and reached Yehem. He heard his officers argue for the wide roads. He chose the narrow pass. His army emerged onto the plain in order. The coalition fled. Megiddo shut its gates. Egyptians stripped the enemy camp. A siege wall of green timber rose around the city. Months passed. The city surrendered. The rulers returned with fewer horses, with obligations renewed, and with families taken as hostages and captives.